Tonight we wade into the gritty, the uncertain, and the not-so-glorious side of healing. Forget the clean, sterile images of modern medicine. What reads like progress in our history books once smelled of blood, fear, and burning flesh. Dropped onto that operating table right now, your trial wasn't surviving the week, it was surviving the next 60 seconds. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. It begins with a quiet scraping sound, a rhythmic, patient abrasion that is almost peaceful. Imagine a small clearing somewhere in the cool, damp forests of Neolithic France, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and wet earth. A person lies on a bed of furs, their head held steady, not by iron clamps, but by the firm, knowing hands of their kin. Above them, another figure works with intense focus. Their tool is not steel, but a piece of sharpened flint, its edge honed to a near-perfect sharpness. They are not stabbing or cutting, not in the way we would imagine. They are scraping. Gently, methodically, a circular groove is being etched into the outer table of the skull. Shaving after shaving of bone fine as dust falls away. This is trepanation, and it is, as far as we can tell, the very first surgical procedure. The skulls they left behind are our only storytellers. In burial sites from the prison basin to the grassy plains of Ukraine, we find them. Skulls bearing these strange, perfectly circular or ovoid holes. And the most remarkable thing about them is not the hole itself, but its edges. The bone is smooth, rounded, showing clear evidence of healing. This was not an execution. This was not a post-mortem ritual. This was a procedure from which the patient often awoke. They walked away, lived for months, sometimes for years, with a permanent window into their own head. A soft spot covered only by scalp and skin. The success rates are, frankly, astonishing. At one site in France, at Chenderon, of the 20 prehistoric skulls found, more than 40 had been trepanned. The vast majority of them showed signs of long-term survival. These were not butchers. They were, in their own way, specialists. But why? Why would anyone, in an age before writing, before metal, before the wheel, decide that the cure for an ailment was to bore a hole through the very bone that protects the brain? The simplest answer, and the one most often assumed, is that it was a treatment for trauma. A warrior takes a blow to the head from a club or a sling stone. The skull fractures, pressing inward on the brain, causing pressure, headaches, perhaps seizures. The practitioner, with a logic we can almost understand, carefully removes the fractured piece of bone, relieving the pressure. It's a compelling theory, a form of primitive practical medicine. And in some cases, looking at the skulls with their healed fracture lines adjacent to the trepanation hole, it seems undeniably true. They were cleaning a wound. But it cannot be the whole story. Too many of the skulls show no sign of prior injury. They are pristine, healthy bone, violated only by the surgeon's flint. Here, we must leave the comfortable world of practical medicine and drift into the realm of belief. Perhaps the patient was suffering from what we would now call epilepsy, or debilitating migraines, or a severe mental illness. To the Neolithic mind, these were not matters of neurology. They were intrusions, a malevolent threat, a bad humour, a pressure from within that had no physical cause but was just as real. The skull was a cage, and the affliction was trapped inside. The solution, therefore, was not to heal but to release, to open a door and let the screaming spirit or the dark vapour escape into the air. The surgery becomes a ritual, an exorcism performed with a stone tool. The practitioner is not just a surgeon but a shaman, a priest. The scraping of the bone is a sacred act, and the survival of the patient is a sign that the gods or the spirits are pleased. The techniques varied, a testament to localized traditions passed down through generations. The scraping method was common in Europe, slow and controlled, minimizing the risk of plunging the tool into the delicate brain tissue below. In other places, they drilled, using a pointed flint awl spun between the palms to create a series of connected burr holes, eventually allowing a larger piece of bone to be lifted out. And in ancient Peru, the Incas became the undisputed masters of the craft. Long after the Neolithic period, they practiced trepanation with a level of skill that would not be seen again for centuries. Their tool was the tumi, a ceremonial bronze or copper knife. Instead of scraping, they made 4 straight-line incisions, creating a square of bone that could be carefully prized out. They understood the dangers, avoiding the midline of the skull where the superior sagittal sinus carries a torrent of blood, a vessel that, if nicked, would mean certain and rapid death. They even seem to have had some rudimentary understanding of anaesthetics, perhaps using coca leaves to numb the area, and primitive antiseptics to clean the wound. Their success rates, based on the healed bone of hundreds of skulls found in the Andes, were often in excess of 80%. A number that would be the envy of the finest surgeon in 18th century Paris or London. For a moment in the high Andes, this brutal ancient practice reached a terrifying and beautiful perfection. Then, like so many ancient arts, it faded. The knowledge was lost, the sacred act forgotten, and surgery, the act of cutting into a living human, fell from the hands of the shaman priest and into the far more commercial and infinitely less hygienic world of the medieval city street. The sacred circle of the trepanation hole gave way to the striped pole, red for blood, white for bandages. Sometimes a brass bowl was added at the top representing the basin used to catch the blood, or at the bottom, the one for lathering a chin. This was the sign not of a hallowed healer, but of the barber surgeon. And for nearly 1,000 years, for the vast majority of people in Europe, this was the face of medicine. It was a trade, not a calling, a craft learned by apprenticeship, not by university lecture. While the learned physicians, draped in academic robes, debated the theories of Galen and Hippocrates in Latin, diagnosing ailments by examining the colour and smell of urine but refusing to touch the patient, it was the barber who got his hands dirty, quite literally. His shop was not a pristine theatre. It was a bustling public space located right on the street, its door open to the swirling miasma of medieval life. The smells of the tannery, the open sewer, and the animal market mingled with the scent of soap, hair, and blood. Inside, it was a one-room enterprise. A wooden chair, perhaps 2, stood in the centre of a floor covered in rushes that were rarely changed, soaking up the day's refuse. On a shelf, the tools of 2 trades lay intermingled, often without distinction. A razor for a morning shave might, an hour later, be used to lance a swollen, pus-filled abscess. The shears for trimming a beard could be used to cut away dead flesh from a gangrenous wound. It was a place of immense practicality. You could come in for a haircut, have a troublesome tooth pulled, be bled to correct an imbalance of your humours, and perhaps have a minor amputation, all in the same afternoon, all in the same chair. The barber surgeon's remit was the body's surface. He was the master of things that could be seen and felt: lumps, bumps, wounds, and breaks. His most common procedure by far was bloodletting. Based on the ancient theory of the 4 humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, illness was seen as an imbalance. Too much of one humour, particularly blood, could lead to everything from fevers to madness. The cure was simple: let some out. The barber would have his patient grasp a staff to make the veins in the arm bulge. He would tie a ligature, select a vein, often the basilic vein in the crook of the elbow, and with a small knife called a lancet, make a quick incision. The blood would arc into a waiting bowl, its volume measured against marks on the inside. The amount let was prescribed by physicians based on the patient's age, constitution, the season, and even the alignment of the stars. It was a routine part of life. People were bled for preventative health, much like we take vitamins today. Monasteries had schedules for the routine bleeding of their monks. It was a moment of weakness, followed by a period of rest and a more nourishing diet. A small, controlled wound in a world full of uncontrolled ones. But their work could be far more invasive. Tooth pulling was a staple, and it was a spectacle of brute force. The patient's head would be held between the barber's knees, their mouth forced open. The primary tool was the dental pelican, a terrifying claw-like instrument that hooked around the tooth and used the gum or adjacent teeth as a fulcrum to lever it out. If that failed, there was the dental key, which was inserted, turned like a key in a lock, and then ripped sideways, often taking a chunk of jawbone and a few neighbouring teeth with it. There was no anaesthetic save for a gulp of strong liquor, and the hope that the barber's hand was swift. And then there were the amputations. While major limb removals were usually left to more specialised surgeons, a barber might be called upon to remove a crushed finger or a gangrenous toe. The procedure was a study in violent efficiency. A tourniquet would be wrenched tight above the site. The barber would take a small crescent-shaped knife, cut a circular incision through the skin and muscle, and then, with a small saw, grind through the bone. The entire ordeal was over in less than a minute. The only method of stopping the bleeding was the cautery iron, a piece of metal heated in the shop's brazier until it glowed cherry red, then pressed against the stump. The hiss of burning flesh and the acrid smell would fill the small room, searing the vessels shut and, with any luck, preventing the patient from bleeding to death on the floor. It was a desperate, agonising solution, and the survival rates were abysmal. Infection, what they called laudable pus or wound fever, was almost a certainty in these unhygienic conditions. The very tools meant to save a life were often the vehicles of death, carrying unseen contagions from one patient to the next. Yet we must not judge them too harshly. The barber surgeon was an essential part of his community. He was affordable, accessible, and his methods, however brutal, were based on the best medical knowledge of the day. In London, they formed the Company of Barber Surgeons in 1540, a powerful guild that regulated the trade and attempted to impose standards. In France, they were the surgeons of the short robe, distinct from the university-trained surgeons of the long robe, and the two groups were in constant bitter conflict over who had the right to perform which procedures. Great military surgeons like the 16th century Frenchman Ambroise Paré began their careers as humble barber surgeons, learning their anatomy not from books, but from the shattered limbs of soldiers on the battlefield. It was Paré who, by a stroke of battlefield genius, abandoned the cautery iron for ligatures, tying off arteries with thread, and accidentally discovered a far more humane and effective way to control bleeding. But his discoveries took centuries to become standard practice. For most of history, if you needed a surgeon's help, you went to the man with the razor and the saw, you sat in his wooden chair, and you prayed that you were strong enough to survive his care. His intentions were good. His instruments, however, were another matter entirely. To open the surgeon's toolkit from the era before anesthesia and antisepsis is to look upon a collection of objects that reject any notion of healing. They feel alien, designed not for the delicate tissues of a living human, but for the unyielding materials of a workshop. They are instruments of carpentry, of butchery, of torture. Their primary design virtues were not precision or finesse, but strength, leverage, and above all speed. When your patient is conscious, screaming and writhing on a wooden table, held down by strong assistants, every second counts. The surgery was not an operation. It was a controlled assault, and these were its weapons. Consider the amputation saw, forget the slender, delicate saws of modern surgery. The 18th century capital saw, as it was called, was a fearsome thing. It often had a heavy, ornate handle made of ebony or ivory, grooved for a firm grip against the inevitable slipping of sweat and blood. The blade itself was wide, thick-spined, and unforgiving, its teeth angled to cut quickly through bone. Some, like the bow saw, had a large frame to keep the blade taut as it bucked and tore through the femur or humerus. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, often engraved with the surgeon's crest, polished to a high sheen. But they were not kept sterile. Between operations, a saw might be wiped with a cloth, its teeth cleared of bone dust and gristle, and then put back in its velvet-lined case ready for the next limb. The goal was to get through the bone in as few strokes as possible, a matter of 10 to 20 seconds. The sound, a wet, grating crunch that echoed in the operating theatre, was said to be unforgettable. The The surgeon would cut through the skin and muscle first with a long, curved amputation knife, and an assistant would pull the flesh back to expose a clean cuff of bone, a technique known as the flap method, pioneered to provide a cushion of tissue to cover the sawn stump. But the centrepiece of the drama was always the saw, and once the limb was off, the great enemy appeared: hemorrhage, the fountain of arterial blood that could drain a life in minutes. Before Ambroise Paré popularisation of the ligature, and for centuries after in many places, the only reliable tool was the cautery iron. A collection of these rested in a brazier at the side of the operating table, their iron heads heating to a brilliant orange red. They came in different shapes for different purposes: flat spade-like heads for searing large stumps, pointed tips for smaller vessels, button-shaped heads for specific bleeding points. The surgeon or his assistant would grab on with a pair of tongs and without hesitation press the glowing metal into the raw weeping wound. The effect was immediate: a violent hiss, a plume of foul-smelling smoke, and the tissue would turn black, the blood vessels seared shut. It was agonizingly painful, a fresh and terrible trauma layered upon the amputation itself, but it worked. It was also a blunt instrument. It destroyed healthy tissue along with the vessels, creating a perfect, dead, nutrient-rich environment to send for infection to thrive. The very act of saving the patient from bleeding to death often condemned them to a slower death from gangrene a week later. For ailments deep within the body, the instruments became even more complex and cruel. The removal of bladder stones, a condition known as lithotomy, was one of the most feared and specialised procedures. The patient would be placed in the dreadful lithotomy position, on their back, legs forced up and wide apart, their hands often tied to their ankles. Without a clear view, the surgeon worked by feel. He would insert a tool called a staff, a curved metal rod, through the urethra and into the bladder to locate the stone. Then he would make an incision in the perineum, the sensitive tissue between the scrotum and the anus, cutting blindly until his knife struck the metal staff. Into this wound he would insert a gorget, a wide groove channel to open the tract. Finally, a variety of forceps and scoops called lithotomies were slid along the gorget into the bladder to grasp the stone and forcibly extract it. The entire procedure was a frantic, bloody scramble inside the patient's body. The risk of sepsis, incontinence, and catastrophic bleeding was immense. Yet surgeons like the Frenchman Jacques de Beaulieu, known as Frère Jacques, became itinerant specialists, travelling from town to town, performing this single, horrific operation with their personalised, terrifying sets of polished steel tools. Battlefields were the great forcing houses of surgical innovation, and they produced their own specialised instruments. With the rise of firearms in the 15th and 16th centuries, surgeons were faced with a new kind of wound, the musket ball. Deep, ragged, and carrying with it fragments of clothing and dirt, it was a wound that almost always became infected. It was believed that gunpowder itself was poisonous, and that the only way to treat the wound was to burn the poison out, often by pouring boiling oil into the cavity. It was Ambroise Paré who, running out of oil one night, simply dressed the wounds with a soothing ointment and discovered, to his astonishment, that his patients healed far better. But the bullet still had to be removed. This required the bullet extractor, a long, slender rod that sometimes ended in a claw-like grabber, or more ingeniously, a screw tip known as a terebellum. This would be probed into the wound channel, hopefully without hitting a major artery, until it located the soft lead of the ball. The surgeon would then attempt to screw the tip into the bullet and carefully, painstakingly pull it back out. And in a dark echo of the very first surgery, the trephine remained a core part of the surgeon's kit. The Neolithic flint scraper had evolved into a fearsome-looking steel instrument. It resembled a carpenter's brace drill, with a T-shaped handle for turning, a central pin for stabilising the drill on the skull, and a circular, saw-toothed crown for cutting. The surgeon would place the pin, begin to turn, and the crown would slowly grind a perfect circle of bone out of the patient's skull, just as his ancestors had done with flint thousands of years before. It was used to relieve pressure from skull fractures, to lift depressed fragments of bone, and to treat headaches or epilepsy. The old belief in releasing spirits still lingering in the metal of the tool. The great danger was the dura, the tough membrane protecting the brain. Go a fraction of a millimetre too deep and the drill would plunge into the brain itself. A skilled surgeon knew the feel, the change in resistance, the subtle difference in the sound of the grinding that told him he was through the inner table of the skull. It was the ultimate test of a steady hand. These instruments laid out on clean cloth today in a museum display look like relics of a barbaric age, and they are. But they are also testaments to a desperate kind of courage, the courage of the patient who submitted to them, and the courage of the surgeon who, in a world without answers, without anaesthesia, and without any true understanding of the causes of disease, picked up his tools and dared to cut. War has always been a rather excellent, if unforgiving, school for surgeons. It provides a volume of patients and a variety of traumas that no peaceful city hospital ever could. In the quiet, orderly world of civilian practice, a surgeon might see a compound fracture once a month. On the battlefield, he might see 100 in an afternoon. This brutal curriculum, paid for in blood and agony, has been in session for as long as men have been organised enough to march in formation. The Roman legions, methodical in all things, were methodical even in their mending of broken men. Each legion had its own medici, a course of physicians and surgeons equipped with a surprisingly sophisticated kit. Tucked away in their leather rolls were bronze scalpels, forceps for extracting arrowheads, bone levers for setting fractures, and cauterizing irons for the messy business of hemorrhage. Along the cold, damp frontiers of the empire, from Hadrian's Wall in Britannia to the banks of the Rhine, they established valetudinaria, permanent military hospitals, the first of their kind, built on a standardized blueprint of corridors and wards designed for hygiene and efficiency. Here, a legionary with a Celtiberian spear point lodged in his shoulder would be laid on a table, and the medicus, with steady hands, would probe, cut, and extract the foreign object, clean the wound with wine or vinegar and stitch it closed. It was a system. It was organised. But the wounds they treated were, for the most of all, the clean, predictable wounds of sword and spear. Then came gunpowder, and the classroom changed forever. The neat slice of a gladius was replaced by the chaotic, ragged wound of the musket ball. A lead sphere, half an ounce in weight, did not cut. It smashed. It tore through flesh, carrying with it filthy scraps of wool uniform and dirt, and it shattered bone into a dozen jagged splinters. A man could survive a sword thrust to the thigh. A musket ball to the same spot meant a one-way trip to the surgeon's tent. The sheer scale of the carnage brought by cannon and musket overwhelmed every system that came before it. A single volley could produce more work than a Roman medicus might see in a year. During the long grinding wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, a new kind of battlefield surgeon emerged, not from the cloistered universities, but from the humble ranks of the barber surgeons, men who learned their anatomy not from books, but from the living, screaming bodies laid out before them on a blood-soaked blanket. One such man was a young Frenchman named Ambroise Paré. In 1537, during the siege of Turin, Paré was a freshly minted army surgeon, following the accepted doctrine of the day for treating gunshot wounds. The theory was that gunpowder was poisonous, and so the wound had to be cleansed with fire, specifically by pouring boiling elderberry oil into the raw cavity. It was a treatment of almost perfect cruelty, but it was the standard of care. One day, after a particularly fierce engagement, Paré ran out of oil. The cauldrons were empty. Faced with a line of wounded soldiers and with his prescribed remedy exhausted, he improvised. He concocted a simple digestif, a soothing balm of egg yolk, oil of roses and turpentine, and applied it as a dressing to the remaining wounds, expecting to find the men dead or dying of poison by morning. He spent a sleepless night, tormented by his failure to apply the agonizing but correct procedure. At dawn he crept back to the ward. The men treated with the boiling oil were feverish, their wounds swollen and inflamed with excruciating pain. but the men he had treated with his gentle balm had rested peacefully. Their wounds were calm, unswollen, and on the path to healing. It was a revelation born of scarcity, an epiphany in the midst of chaos. Pare had learned by accident that the body did not need to be tortured to be healed. He would go on to repopularise the ancient technique of using silk thread, ligatures, to tie off arteries instead of searing them shut with a red-hot iron, another small act of mercy that would, over centuries, save an ocean of pain. But these were whispers of progress in a hurricane of slaughter. The true apotheosis of pre-anaesthetic military surgery arrived with the Napoleonic Wars. The scale was almost unimaginable. At the Battle of Borodino in 1812, the French and Russian armies suffered a combined 70,000 casualties in a single day. At Waterloo, nearly 50,000 men fell. These were not numbers. They were individual bodies, torn apart by cannonballs, grape shot and bayonets, all in desperate need of a surgeon's attention. The man who rose to meet this challenge was another Frenchman, a short, intense surgeon of genius named Baron Dominique Jean Larrey. As Napoleon's chief surgeon, Larrey was present at nearly every major battle, from the Egyptian pyramids to the frozen plains of Russia. And what he saw in his early campaigns was a logistical nightmare. The wounded were often left on the field for 24 hours or more, collected only after the fighting had stopped. By then, it was usually too late. Shock, blood loss, or the simple cold had finished the work the enemy had begun. A shattered leg that might have been saved became a death sentence through sheer delay. Larry's solution was a stroke of organisational brilliance. The ambulance volante, the flying ambulance. These were not hospitals, but lightweight horse-drawn carriages, well-sprung and staffed with a trained team of stretcher-bearers and surgeons' assistants. Their job was to follow the advance guards into battle, to retrieve the wounded under fire, give them rudimentary first aid, and transport them immediately back to the field hospital set up just behind the lines. It was the birth of the modern paramedic system. It was triage, and it was revolutionary. It meant that a soldier who fell with a shattered arm could be on an operating table within the hour, not the day. This speed, this efficiency was the key. It allowed Larry and his surgeons to perform what became their signature operation, the one that gave a man his only chance, immediate amputation. Larry's rule was simple and grim. If a limb was badly shattered by a musket ball, or worse, a cannonball, it had to come off. And it had to come off now, within the first 24 hours. Any later, an infection, what they called hospital gangrene, would set in, and death was a near certainty. So to picture the scene, the field hospital is not a hospital at all. It is a commandeered farmhouse, a stone church, a nobleman's chateau. The great ballroom, its crystal chandeliers still hanging from the ceiling, is now the operating theatre. The fine parquet floor is covered in a thick layer of straw which is soon trampled into a dark, stinking morass of mud, water and blood. In one corner, a massive pile of amputated arms and legs grows steadily higher, tossed there like so much cordwood. The air is thick with the coppery smell of blood, the stench of sweat and unwashed bodies, the sour odour of infection, and the sharp, acidic tang of fear. And above it all, a constant, dreadful chorus of sound, the low moans of the waiting, the sharp, piercing screams of the men on the tables, and the rhythmic, grating rasp of the surgeon's saw. The surgeons, men like Larry, worked for days on end with no rest. They stood for 36 hours at a stretch, their arms bare to the elbow, their aprons so stiff with dried blood they could stand on their own. They moved from man to man with a weary, practised economy of motion. There was no time for deliberation, no room for sentiment. A quick probe of the wound, a swift diagnosis, and then the verdict. This one must come off. Larry himself was a master of this grim craft. He was said to be able to perform an amputation of the shoulder joint, one of the most difficult operations imaginable, in under a minute. This wasn't bravado. It was a race against shock, a race against blood loss, a race against the inevitable onset of a pain so overwhelming it could kill a man on its own. The speed was the only mercy they could offer. In the 3 days following the Battle of Waterloo, British surgeons alone performed over 1,000 amputations. It was an industry of dismemberment, a production line of survival, where the measure of success was not a whole man, but a living one. Let us then, if you can bear or bear it, step a little closer. Let us push through the throng of moaning soldiers lining the walls of that French chateau and approach one of the operating tables. It is not a table, really, but 2 wine barrels with a thick plank laid across them. On this makeshift altar lies a young grenadier, no more than 20. A chunk of British grapeshot has shattered his right tibia just below the knee, leaving a mangled ruin of flesh and bone. He is conscious, of course. His eyes are wide with terror, fixed on the surgeon who approaches, wiping his instruments on his bloody apron. There is no gentle conversation, no reassurance. There is no time. Strong assistants, hardened artillerymen, take hold of the boy's arms, his torso, his good leg. He is pinned to the plank, a living sacrifice. Another man holds his head, ready to clamp a hand over his mouth, not to spare the surgeon's ears, but to stop the patient from biting off his own tongue. A leather-wrapped bullet is thrust between his teeth. "Bite on this, son." The surgeon works with a fearsome calm. His first action is to take up the tourniquet. It is a thick strap of leather with a brass screw clamp. He wraps it high around the boy's thigh, well above the shattered knee, and begins to twist the handle. The pressure is immense, a crushing, agonizing grip that bites deep into the muscle, cutting off the great river of the femoral artery. The leg below the strap instantly grows numb and cold, but the pain of the tourniquet itself is breathtaking. It is the first wave of an ocean of agony. The surgeon wastes no time. He selects his primary tool, the amputating knife. It is a beautiful and terrible instrument, long, curved and honed to a razor's edge. He grasps the boy's thigh with his left hand, feeling for the bone. Then in one single fluid movement he sweeps the knife around the leg. There is a sound like tearing fabric as the blade slices through skin, through the pale yellow layer of fat, through the fascia beneath. The boy's body arches against the hands holding him down, and a choked, guttural scream escapes past the bullet in his mouth. But the surgeon is already moving on. He does not even seem to register the sound. With a smaller knife, he peels back the skin and fat, creating a cuff, a flap that will be used to cover the stump later. This is the mark of a skilled practitioner. A butcher just cut straight through. A surgeon plans for the healing. He now has a clear view of the thick red muscles of the thigh. He switches his grip on the large knife. The next cut goes deeper, severing the powerful quadriceps on the top, the hamstrings underneath. The muscles, suddenly released from their anchor points, retract with a grotesque twitching motion, pulling back from the blade and exposing the stark white gleam of the femur. The assistants have to work harder now. The boy's thrashing is a desperate primal response to a pain that has overloaded every circuit in his brain. Now comes the saw. It is a simple frame saw, not so different from one a carpenter might use. The surgeon places the teeth against the bone, steadying it with his thumb, and then he begins to draw it back and forth. The sound is the most unforgettable of all. It is not a clean, cutting sound. It is a wet, grating animal noise, a rhythmic grinding rasp that vibrates through the entire table, up through the hands of the men holding the patient down, into the very floorboards of the chateau. The boy's screams dissolve into a continuous, high-pitched keen, the sound of a soul being shredded. The surgeon's strokes are long and steady, his face a mask of concentration. Sawdust, pinkish with blood and marrow, sprays onto his apron. He's focused only on the bone, on keeping the cut clean, on not letting the saw bind. He puts his weight into it, his whole body swaying in time with the rhythm of the blade. Then, with a final sickening crack, the bone gives way.
The lower leg, for a moment still held by a few remaining sinews, is severed completely. An assistant catches it before it falls to the bloody straw and tosses it unceremoniously onto the growing pile in the corner. The worst of the pain is over. The peak has passed, but the procedure is not. The assistants carefully loosen the tourniquet just a fraction. The surgeon peers into the raw, weeping face of the stump. He can see the severed arteries, pulsing feebly. Using a delicate pair of forceps, he plucks the end of the femoral artery, pulls it out slightly from the surrounding muscle, and with a pre-threaded needle, his assistant passes him a ligature of waxed silk thread. He ties a neat, tight knot around the vessel. He repeats this for the other, smaller arteries he can see, meticulously stemming the tide of lifeblood. This is the legacy of Pare, this small humane act with a piece of thread. Once the bleeding is controlled, he takes the flap of skin he so carefully created at the beginning and pulls it down over the raw, sawn end of the femur. He begins to stitch it into place, creating a cushion for the bone. The final dressing is a simple pad of linen, a pledget, soaked in wine or turpentine, held in place by tight bandages. The whole affair, from the first turn of the tourniquet to the final stitch, has taken perhaps 5 minutes. For the young grenadier, it was an eternity spent in a dimension of pure pain. He is gently lifted from the bloody plank and carried to a cot in a quieter room, if such a thing exists. He is given a sip of water, perhaps a little wine. He has survived the scalpel. Now he must survive the fever, the infection, the gangrene, the long, slow and uncertain process of healing. He is one of the lucky ones. He had a skilled surgeon and he was operated on quickly. For many others, the journey ended right there, on the blood-soaked floor of a makeshift operating theatre. And yet, that small, almost delicate act of tying off an artery with a silken thread, a technique passed down from the ancients and repopularised by men like Pare, was a relatively recent innovation. For a surgeon like Larry, it was the standard of care, the only proper way to control the hemorrhage that was the true killer on the operating table. But for centuries before, and even concurrently in less enlightened corners of the surgical world, the surgeon's final and most terrible tool was not the needle, but the fire. Before the ligature, the only reliable way to stop a major vessel from bleeding was to burn it shut. The practice was called cauterization, and it was a trial by fire in the most literal sense. It was the desperate, brutal exchange of one horror for another. You traded the certainty of bleeding to death in minutes for the agonizing torment of a deep and terrible burn and the mere possibility of survival. The cauterizing iron was a simple, heavy tool. It came in many shapes, designed for different purposes. Some were like buttons for searing the face of an open stump. Others were shaped like knives for slicing through infected tissue while simultaneously sealing the wound. They were kept in a brazier of glowing charcoal near the operating area, their long wooden handles sticking out waiting. When needed, an assistant would use a pair of tongs to pull an iron from the coals. It would be glowing a dull, menacing cherry red, radiating a visible wave of heat. The sight of it alone was enough to make a man faint. The smell of it was the smell of a blacksmith's forge, hot and metallic. Imagine our grenadier again, but a century earlier. The amputation has just been completed. The saw has done its work, the leg is gone. But now, instead of the surgeon reaching for forceps and thread, he nods to his assistant at the brazier. The assistant brings forth the glowing iron. The surgeon takes it, the heat palpable even through its long handle. He does not hesitate. He presses the flat, searing face of the iron directly onto the raw, bleeding stump. The sound is not something the mind can easily conjure. It is a loud, violent hiss, a sizzle, and a pop as blood, water, and fat vaporize on contact. A thick plume of greasy, foul-smelling smoke billows up, carrying the sickeningly sweet scent of cooked meat. The patient, who may have thought the worst was over, is slammed by a new and even more horrific pain. It is not the sharp, clean pain of the knife, but a deep, searing, consuming agony that seems to burn its way straight to the bone. His body convulses, a single violent spasm against the assistant's grip.
The shriek he emits is of a different quality now, a sound of pure, unendurable violation. The surgeon holds the iron in place for a few seconds, moving it around the stump to touch every major bleeding point. He is creating an eschar, a thick, blackened, leathery scab of burned tissue. The intense heat coagulates the proteins in the blood and sears the mouths of the vessels shut. It is a crude and violent method, but it works. The bleeding stops. The iron is withdrawn, leaving behind a charred, smoking, hideous ruin. The patient, if he is still conscious, is often limp, his body and mind having retreated into the grey fog of profound shock. The surgeon has won the battle against hemorrhage, but he has inflicted a catastrophic injury in the process. This eschar, this shield of burned flesh, is dead tissue, and dead tissue is the perfect breeding ground for infection. In a week or so, if the patient survives that long, the eschar will begin to rot and slough off. And as it does, there is a very real danger that the sealed arteries beneath will open up again, causing a secondary hemorrhage that is often just as fatal as the first. The cautery was a desperate gambit. It was a surgeon betting that the immediate trauma of the burn was more survivable than the immediate trauma of blood loss, and that he could somehow manage the inevitable infection that would follow. The great Arab surgeon of the Middle Ages, Albucasis of Cordoba, devoted an entire volume of his medical encyclopedia to the uses of cautery, describing more than 50 different applications, from stopping nosebleeds to burning out cancerous tumours. For 1,000 years it was not an exception, but a cornerstone of surgical practice. It was the final terrible weapon in an arsenal of pain, the embodiment of a medical philosophy that believed the only way to drive out a great evil was with an even greater fire. Of all the torments that could settle into the pre-modern body, few were as exquisitely cruel as the slow grinding formation of a stone in the bladder. A misery that began as a dull ache, a slight difficulty, would over months and years calcify into an agonizing, jagged mass. Every step, every cough, every movement sent a shock of white-hot pain through the pelvis. It was a constant internal torture, rendering life a waking nightmare. And for this specific brand of suffering there existed a specific and equally terrifying brand of salvation, the lithotomist, the stonecutter. These were not always learned physicians from the great universities of Padua or Paris. More often they were itinerant specialists, moving from town to town with a leather roll of specialised tools and a fearsome reputation. They were craftsmen of the flesh, their trade passed down through apprenticeships, a grim art perfected through repetition on countless writhing bodies. To the desperate patient, their arrival was a blend of hope and absolute dread. The procedure itself, the lithotomy, was a masterpiece of controlled brutality. Imagine a public square, or perhaps the wooden floor of a wealthy patient's home, cleared for the occasion. There is no sterile field, no quiet hum of machinery. There is only the patient, very much awake, and the gathered crowd of onlookers, a mix of grimly fascinated townsfolk and aspiring surgeons. The patient would be given a stiff drink of wine or brandy, not for pain but for courage, a hollow gesture. Then they were placed in the lithotomy position, a posture of ultimate vulnerability, on their back, legs forced up and apart, their wrists often tied to their ankles to arch the body and expose the perineum. 2 or 3 strong assistants, their faces grimly set, would pin the patient's shoulders and legs, their primary role to counteract the inevitable violent thrashing that was to come. The surgeon would begin one of the oldest methods practiced for centuries and formalised in the 16th century by Marianus Sanctus Barolitanus, was known as the apparatus major, or the Marian operation. The name sounds grand, almost liturgical. The reality was anything but. The surgeon would first insert a grooved metal rod called a staff through the urethra and into the bladder. The sound of the staff striking the stone, a distinct audible click, was the first confirmation of the diagnosis, a point of no return. Using this staff as a guide, the surgeon would then make a deep incision in the perineum, just to the side of the midline. They cut through skin, fat and muscle, aiming for the neck of the bladder. The knife used for this was often a bisturi, a long, slender blade. Once the initial cut was made, a second instrument, the gorget, was introduced. This was a terrifying tool, a wide-beaked and grooved metal instrument designed to be forced along the staff, tearing a wider path into the bladder. The goal was to create an opening large enough to admit the final set of instruments, the forceps. These were long, spoon-like clamps, sometimes with serrated teeth, which the surgeon would blindly insert into the bladder, probing and grasping for the stone. This was the most agonizing part of the ordeal. The surgeon, guided only by touch and sound, would fish around inside one of the body's most sensitive organs, clamping down on the stone. If it was too large to be pulled out in one piece, it had to be crushed inside the bladder with a heavier instrument called a lithoclast, the crunching sound sickeningly audible to everyone in the room. Then the fragments were removed, piece by jagged piece. The entire procedure, from first cut to final extraction, was a race against time, a desperate sprint to be completed before the patient died from shock or bled to death on the table. If successful, the surgeon would hold up the bloody stone for all to see, a trophy of their grim victory. The patient, pale and trembling, was then untied, the gaping wound in their perineum simply packed with lint and linen dressing, soaked in wine or turpentine, and left to the mercies of fate. The aftermath was a battle in itself. The odds were appalling. Hemorrhage was a constant threat, as major blood vessels were often severed in the blind cutting. But the true enemy, the invisible killer, was infection. In a world that knew nothing of germs, where surgeons operated in their street clothes with unwashed hands and unsterilised instruments, sepsis was almost a certainty. The wound would fester, fever would set in, and the patient would often descend into a delirious death over the course of a week. Even for the survivors, the price of life could be steep. The cutting often destroyed the urinary sphincter, leaving the patient permanently incontinent, or it could create a fistula, an abnormal channel that leaked urine constantly. Still, people lined up for the stonecutters. The French friar Jacques de Beaulieu, known as Frère Jacques, became famous in the late 17th century for his lateral approach, cutting from the side to avoid the rectum. He operated on thousands, and while his method was influential, his personal mortality rates were catastrophic, sometimes exceeding 50%. Yet the pain of the stone was so absolute that a 50-50 chance of death seemed a reasonable wager. In the 18th century, men like the English surgeon William Cheselden at St Thomas's Hospital in London refined the lateral operation to a terrifying art form. He was a master of the body's geography, and his incredible speed became legendary. He could perform a complete lithotomy in under a minute, a horrifying whirlwind of precise violence that at least minimised the duration of the agony. His mortality rates were better, perhaps 1 in 10, a stunning achievement for the time. But even with the fastest knife in England, the fundamental horror remained. The patient was a conscious participant in their own dissection, their survival depending entirely on the cutter's speed, the strength of the assistants, and a tremendous amount of luck. The stonecutter's art was a necessary evil, a brutal bargain made at the edge of endurance, where the only thing worse than the cure was the disease itself. The reason that a seemingly straightforward procedure like removing a stone from the bladder was so fraught with peril, so dependent on the blind luck of the surgeon's knife, was simple. The surgeon was operating in the dark, not just literally, in the often poorly lit rooms and theatres of the day, but intellectually. The internal map of the human body they carried in their minds was a curious and often dangerously inaccurate document, a blend of folklore, animal anatomy, and the received wisdom of ancient authorities who had rarely, if ever, dissected a human being. How could one confidently cut into a patient to extract a stone, or set a complex fracture, or amputate a limb, when the precise location of a major artery or nerve was a matter of conjecture? The butchery of the lithotomist's table was a direct consequence of the ignorance of the anatomist's lab. To move from butchery towards science, the surgeon first needed a better map, a true map, and to create that map, Someone had to defy centuries of religious and social taboo. Someone had to open up the human body and look, truly look, for themselves. For over 1,000 years, European medicine had been dominated by the ghost of one man, Galen of Pergamon, a Greek physician who practiced in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. Galen was a brilliant and prolific writer, and his anatomical works were the undisputed bedrock of medical education well into the Renaissance. There was just one problem. Roman law and custom forbade the dissection of human corpses, so Galen did the next best thing. He dissected animals, a lot of them, pigs, goats, and most famously Barbary apes, which he believed were the closest anatomical match to humans. For over 1,300 years, the medical world accepted his findings as gospel. A human liver, they were taught, had 5 lobes, because a pig's liver did. The human jawbone was 2 separate pieces, because an ape's was. The great veins originated from the liver. This was the truth. The setting for challenging this truth was the dissection theatre of the great European universities, like Bologna or Padua. But these were not centres of empirical discovery. They were stages for the performance of ancient knowledge. Picture a cold, tiered circular room like a small amphitheatre. In the centre, on a slab, lies a corpse, usually that of an executed criminal, the only bodies legally available for such purposes. On a high chair, a throne-like cathedra, sits the professor of anatomy. He does not touch the body. He holds a copy of Galen's text, reading the ancient Latin passages aloud. Below him stands a surgeon, often called a demonstrator or sector, whose job is to perform the actual cutting. And next to him, a man with a long pointer. The ostensor indicates the parts of the body being described from the text. The students watch from the tiered seats above. If the surgeon's knife revealed something in the corpse that contradicted the words of Galen being read from the lectern, and it often did, it was not Galen who was wrong. It was the corpse. This particular criminal, it would be concluded, was a deformed anomaly. The text was sacrosanct. The evidence of one's own eyes was not. Into this world of rigid dogma stepped a young, ambitious, and ferociously brilliant Fleming, named Andreas Vesalius. Born in Brussels in 1514 to a family of physicians, Vesalius was obsessed with anatomy from a young age. As a student in Paris, he grew profoundly frustrated with the theatrical, hands-off approach of his teachers. He wanted to see for himself. He began to frequent the charnel houses and execution grounds, stealing bones and body parts to study in secret. He famously reassembled his first full human skeleton from the remains of a criminal left hanging on a gibbet outside the city walls, picking it apart piece by piece over several nights. When he became a professor at the University of Padua at the astonishing age of 23, he did something revolutionary. He descended from the professor's chair. He dismissed the separate cutter and pointer. He put on an apron, picked up the knife himself, and performed the dissections for his students with his own hands, describing what he saw, not what Galen had written. For 5 years, Vesalius dissected, drew, and documented. He saw that the human jawbone was one solid piece, not 2. He saw that the liver had 2 main lobes, not 5. He saw that the heart, not the liver, was the centre of the vascular system. He corrected over 200 of Galen's long-standing errors. The logistics of this work were immense. Obtaining fresh corpses was a constant struggle. He developed a network of friendly judges who would time executions to coincide with his anatomy lectures. He and his students were known to engage in a bit of body snatching from freshly buried graves when official channels failed. He worked quickly in the cold Italian winters to slow the inevitable putrefaction of the unembalmed bodies. And all this work culminated in 1543 with the publication of one of the most important and beautiful books in the history of science, De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libri Septem, or On the Fabric of the Human Body in 7 books. The Fabrica was more than just a textbook. It was a work of art, complete overthrow of ancient authority based on direct empirical observation. Nearly 700 pages long, it was filled with magnificent, detailed woodcut illustrations, created by artists from the workshop of Titian. These were not the crude schematic diagrams of earlier texts. They were works of astonishing detail and artistry. The famous muscle men were depicted as flayed figures, their muscles and sinews exposed, standing in dramatic classical poses against the backdrop of the Italian countryside. The skeletons contemplate mortality, leaning on spades and skulls. It was a book that showed the human body not as a theoretical concept from an ancient text, but as a complex, beautiful, and knowable structure. It was the first accurate map. The publication of the Fabrica was a seismic event. It was a declaration of independence for anatomy. It enraged the traditional Galenists, who attacked Vesalius viciously for his arrogance in daring to challenge the master. But for surgeons, it was a revelation. For the first time, they had reliable charts to guide their hands. They could now visualize the path of the sciatic nerve they had to avoid during an amputation, or understand the precise layering of muscle and fascia they needed to cut through to reach a bladdered stone. The pain of surgery did not disappear overnight, not by a long shot. But the Fabrica marked a fundamental shift. It replaced blind, hazardous guesswork with knowledge. The surgeon was still an agent of agony, but he was no longer an agent of ignorance. He was now a craftsman with a proper blueprint, a navigator with a true chart of the treacherous territory that lay beneath the skin. The age of scientific surgery had begun, even if the age of humane surgery was still a century away. The scalpel was now guided by sight, but the patient's ordeal still demanded a very particular kind of wielder. With a more accurate map of the body laid out by Vesalius and his successors, the surgeon's task became less a matter of blind exploration and more one of precise, targeted assault. Yet this new knowledge did not lessen the sheer horror of the experience for the patient strapped to the table. In the absence of anaesthesia, the single most important virtue of the surgeon was not, perhaps, knowledge or even dexterity. It was speed. The ideal surgeon of this era was a human whirlwind, a blur of motion whose primary goal was to conclude the ordeal in the absolute minimum amount of time. Every second saved was a second less of unendurable agony, a second less of life-threatening shock to the system. The operating theatre was a theatre of speed. Surgeons built their careers and their legendary reputations on how quickly they could perform their grim work. They were often described in terms more suited to a duelist or a sprinter. 2 minutes, a surgeon might be heard to mutter, consulting his pocket watch as the patient was brought in for a major amputation. The phrase "cut quick and cut well" became the surgeon's unofficial creed. Perhaps no one embodied this ethos of blistering speed more than Robert Liston, a towering, formidable Scottish surgeon practising in London in the early 19th century. Liston was a force of nature. 6'2", immensely strong and famously abrupt, he radiated an aura of intimidating confidence. But it was his speed that made him a legend. He could amputate a leg at the thigh in under 30 seconds. Witnesses described his movements as almost too fast to follow. The patient would be restrained. Liston would stride into the room, call out, "Time me, gentlemen," and the work would begin. A flash of the knife, the high-pitched grate of the saw on bone for a few seconds, the thud of the severed limb hitting the sawdust-covered floor, and it was over. He was known to hold the bloody amputation knife between his teeth while his hands worked to tie off the arteries. This astonishing velocity was not for show. It was a profound, if brutal, act of mercy. It was also, at times, dangerous. In his most infamous case, Liston's speed got the better of him. During a leg amputation, he worked so quickly that he accidentally amputated the fingers of his young assistant who was holding the patient's leg. The knife also slashed the coattails of a distinguished spectator who, believing he had been stabbed, promptly dropped dead from fright. To complete the tragic trifecta, the patient later died of sepsis. It remains, quite possibly, the only surgical operation in history with a 300% mortality rate. Yet for all that, patients sought him out too, because a minute under Liston's lightning-fast knife was considered vastly preferable to 10 minutes in the hands of a slower, more hesitant surgeon. Alongside speed, the pre-anaesthetic surgeon required immense physical strength. This was not the delicate microsurgical work of today. It was a strenuous, physically demanding craft. Patients, even with assistants holding them down, did not lie still. They fought. They writhed and bucked against their restraints, their bodies fueled by terror and agony. The surgeon needed the strength to overpower this resistance, to hold a limb steady with one arm while sawing through bone with the other. The tools themselves required force. Reducing a dislocated hip was an act of brute traction, often requiring the combined strength of the surgeon and several assistants pulling on straps and pulleys. Sawing through the femur, the largest bone in the body, was hard physical labour, sending a shower of bone dust into the air. Surgeons were often large, physically imposing men, their fine frock coats stained with the blood and sweat of their exertions. The French surgeon Dominique Jean Larrey, Napoleon's chief surgeon, was renowned not only for his innovations with the flying ambulance on the battlefield, but for his sheer physical endurance. He performed hundreds of amputations in a single day during the brutal Russian campaign, working tirelessly for hours on end in horrific conditions, his strength and stamina the only thing standing between a wounded soldier and certain death from gangrene. But perhaps the most essential quality, the one that truly defined the character of the surgeon in the age of agony, was a psychological one, an almost inhuman detachment. Steel nerves, the ability to perform precise, intricate work while being assailed by the most harrowing sounds a human being can produce. The operating theatre was a symphony of suffering. The high, piercing screams, the guttural moans, the desperate pleas for mercy or for death. These were the constant soundtrack to the surgeon's work. To function in such an environment day after day required a profound act of will, a conscious decision to wall off empathy and emotion. Surgeons had to cultivate a detached, almost cold demeanour. They could not allow themselves to be moved by the patient's terror. To hesitate, to be swayed by a plea, would be to endanger the patient's life, to botch the procedure through a moment of sympathetic weakness. This necessary emotional armour often made surgeons appear callous and unfeeling. They were seen as men apart, respected for their skill and feared for their craft. The public perceived them as being in some essential way different from ordinary men, hardened by their daily proximity to death and pain. They were the ultimate last resort, the men you turned to when all else had failed, knowing they would hurt you more terribly than you could possibly imagine, all in the desperate hope of saving your life. This unique combination of anatomical knowledge, lightning speed, raw physical power, and a heart shielded in iron was the apex of surgical skill before the quiet miracle of chloroform and ether drifted into the operating theatre. It was the best that a conscious patient could hope for, a brilliant, fast and unfeeling monster. To step into an operating theatre before the middle of the 19th century was to enter a sealed and sovereign kingdom, a small, soundproofed room ruled by a triumvirate of silent, ever-present tyrants. These were not men, but forces of nature, ancient and implacable, and every surgeon, no matter how skilled or famous, was merely their courtier, forever bowing to their whims, forever negotiating the terms of a patient's survival against their overwhelming power. The first of these, the most immediate and visceral, was pain. It is a simple word, but in this context, it was an entity. It was not merely a side effect of the operation, it was an active combatant, a physiological foe that could kill as surely as the disease the surgeon sought to cure. The shock induced by a saw grating through bone or a knife slicing through the dense network of nerves in the abdomen could, and frequently did, send a patient into a fatal cascade of organ failure before the final stitch was even considered. This overwhelming reality dictated the entire strategy of surgery. It was not a delicate art of exploration and repair, but a brutal exercise in pure, unadulterated speed. The surgeon was not a technician, he was a sprinter. His merit was measured not in the neatness of his sutures, but in the ticks of the pocket watch held by a mesmerised student in the front row of the gallery. In London, the undisputed champion of this terrifying race against the clock was Robert Liston, a towering, imposing figure working at the University College Hospital in the 1830s and 40s. Liston was famous for his almost theatrical celerity. "Time me, gentlemen," he he would reportedly announce to the gallery of onlookers before starting a procedure. His amputations were the stuff of legend. In under 30 seconds, he could have a leg off, the limb tossed into a waiting box of sawdust, the arteries clamped, all before the patient's mind had even fully processed the first searing touch of the blade. This velocity was not for showmanship. It was a strategic necessity, a desperate attempt to outrun the killing power of nervous shock. But such speed came at a cost. Precision was its first casualty. In his haste, Liston was known to have accidentally amputated a patient's testicles along with his leg. In his most infamous case, his flashing knife work was so rapid that he not only removed the patient's leg in under 3 minutes, but also took off the fingers of his young assistant who was holding the leg steady. As if that weren't enough, in the flurry of his movements he slashed the coat of a distinguished surgical spectator who, believing he had been stabbed in a vital organ, promptly dropped dead of fright. The patient later died of infection, as did the assistant. It remains, quite possibly, the only operation in surgical history with a 300% mortality rate. It is a darkly comical anecdote, but it reveals the core truth of the era. Pain transformed the surgical theatre into a place of barely controlled chaos. The second member of this grim triumvirate was hemorrhage, uncontrolled bleeding. The body, when opened, is a fountain, and for centuries surgeons had very few effective ways to turn off the flow. This was a problem of logistics, of plumbing and pressure. For an amputation, the first line of defence was the tourniquet, a simple strap cinched brutally tight above the site of the incision, cutting off the major flow of blood to the limb. The concept was ancient, but it was refined in the early 18th century by the French surgeon Jean-Louis Petit, who developed a screw device that could apply more focused and sustained pressure. This was a crucial innovation. It bought the surgeon time. But it was a crude tool, crushing muscle and nerve tissue indiscriminately, and it was useless for any operation on the torso or head. For wounds in those areas, surgeons had to rely on two far more primitive techniques. The first was direct pressure, simply packing the wound with lint and bandages, and hoping that the body's own clotting mechanisms would eventually do the work. This was, at best, a gamble. The second and far more dramatic option was the cautery. A set of iron tools, shaped with flat heads or sharp points, would be heated in a nearby brazier until they glowed a malevolent cherry red. The surgeon would then press the searing metal directly onto the bleeding vessel or into the open wound. The stench of cooking flesh would instantly fill the room, a thick, greasy smoke that clung to the curtains and the woolen coats of the observers. The hiss was unmistakable. It was the sound of tissue being flash-boiled, of blood being vaporized, of life being purchased at the price of immense collateral damage. Cautery was effective at stopping bleeding, but it created a deep, weeping burn, an ideal breeding ground for what was to come. It was a messy, destructive solution. A more elegant, but far more difficult solution was the ligature. The idea of tying off individual blood vessels with a thread had been around since Roman times, but it was popularised and refined in the 16th century by the great French military surgeon Ambroise Paré. On the battlefields of Italy, surrounded by the horrific wounds inflicted by early firearms, Paré grew to despise the brutality of the cautery iron. He revived and perfected the technique of using a small hook to gently pull out the severed end of an artery from the surrounding muscle and quickly tying it off with a silk thread. It was a revolutionary act of finesse in a world of brute force. It was far less destructive than the hot iron, and in theory it offered a cleaner path to healing. But it was also technically demanding. It required a steady hand, a good knowledge of anatomy to find the right vessel in a bloody, screaming mess, and time, the one resource that the first tyrant pain would not allow. So, for centuries, surgeons were caught in a strategic trap. The fast, brutal methods like cautery bought time from hemorrhage, but created wounds that were almost guaranteed to become infected. The slower, more elegant methods like ligature were often impossible to perform on a conscious, writhing patient. Every operation was a grim calculation, a trade-off between the three great powers that ruled the theatre: And even if the surgeon successfully navigated the Scylla and Charybdis of pain and bleeding, the third and most patient tyrant was waiting. Its name was infection. Infection was the ghost at the feast, the silent partner in every surgical procedure. It was the great paradoxical threat of the pre-germ theory world. Surgeons of the 18th and early 19th centuries were men of science, children of the Enlightenment. They studied anatomy with vigour. They understood the mechanics of the circulatory system, but they had absolutely no conception of microbiology. The enemy was invisible, and therefore it did not exist. A surgeon's operating